Mark Twain reportedly said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." Heather, you often say it yourself. The rhyming is out of control these days. I've heard you said, and this is related to a question that Sophia asked us earlier, a group of students. Where are you, Sophia? Oh, you gotta scream or something and let us know you're here, because she's... Oh, there she is. And Sophia wanted to know, basically, how does this time compare? She wanted to, like, how does this compare to the Civil War? I was prepared, and I told her, don't ask the question, because I was going to ask you this question. Because in an interview that you did, you said that looking at the Civil War as the corollary is not the right framing, that it's really 1860. Talk more about that.
So whenever anybody, I mean, I could do parallels all over the place. And unless something has happened since we've been here, you're all going to read tonight, those of you who follow me are going to read about the presidential election of 1880 tonight, which I know you really want to know about. But when people ask me what this moment feels like, I always say the 1850s, which rarely brings comfort. But what I mean by that is that if you lived in the United States in 1853, it looked as if the elite enslavers in the American South had got it all. They'd gotten the White House, they had gotten the Supreme Court, and they'd gotten the Senate. And the only place that those people who did not believe in the spread of human enslavement to the West still had control was in the House of Representatives. And then in 1854, Congress gets through the House of Representatives the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act overrides the Missouri Compromise to say that, in fact, enslavement can go into the American West, into that part of the American West that came into the Union with the Louisiana Purchase. And with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, those elite enslavers were going to have control over the entire United States, because what it meant to move there at the time property into the American West was that all the states that would be constructed there would have to be slave states, because the Constitution mandates the protection of property. And those Western slave states would work with the Southern slave states to overawe the Northern free states in the Congress, and America would become a slaveholding nation. That was explicitly what they wanted to do. They said so. Well, it seemed like the game was over, except that the day it became clear that the Kansas-Nebraska Act was going to pass through the House of Representatives, a number of congressmen have a meeting in Mrs. Crutchett's boarding house in Washington, D.C., in the rooms of Edward Dickinson, who was a representative from Massachusetts, and whose daughter was already writing poetry. She was indeed Emily Dickinson. He was indeed Emily Dickinson's father. She was not a recluse then. She actually visited him in Washington. But what was interesting about that moment and that meeting of those 30 men, aside from the fact they picked that boarding house because Mrs. Crutchett was the best cook in Washington, was that they went into that room as Democrats and as Whigs and as Free Soilers and as Know-Nothings, the anti-immigrant party, and they said to each other, we don't agree about immigration, we don't agree about foreign affairs, we don't agree about finances, we don't agree about internal improvements, but we can agree that we don't want the slave power to destroy our democracy. And they went forward from that meeting as an anti-Nebraska party. By 1855 and 1856, they're going to sweep the House of Representatives. By 1858, they're going to have a new champion in Abraham Lincoln. By 1859, he's going to articulate a new ideology for a new political party. This is the Republican Party that calls for a government that does not simply protect property, but that acts for the good of ordinary Americans. By 1860, that coalition of all white men is going to elect him to the White House. By 1863, January of 1863, he's going to have signed the Emancipation Proclamation, getting rid of enslavement in the areas that are still controlled by the Confederacy. And by November of 1863, he is going to give the Gettysburg Address that calls for a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and who dedicates America to a new birth of freedom. 10 years. in less than 10 years, you go from James Henry Hammond gets it all, senator from South Carolina, who talks about how a few elite people should run the country and everybody else is the mudsills that are driven into the dirt to support that upper group of people. You go from he gets everything, he and his ilk get everything, to the government belongs to the people. Less than 10 years. And when I look at this moment where we have, for example, a number of Republicans and independents turning against the extremism in the current Republican Party, this is what I see. If you had told me that Dick Cheney and I were going to be on the same side of anything a year ago, and what I would say to that is that I do think we're in a moment like this, but one of the things I hear all the time is, well, I'm going to be a Republican, no matter what happens in this year. And I always think, okay. But in 1860, all those guys who came into that room to create a new political party, 10 years later, you can't really predict where they were going to come out in the next iteration because all the issues had changed so dramatically. So that some of the people who went into that room as Democrats and said we are always going to be Democrats leave in 1866, leave the Civil War as dyed-in-the-wool Republicans who will never change their opinions, and some of them actually go back and become, Democrats like Salmon P. Chase. So that's what I see in this moment.